Hello, I hope you're doing well today. Thank you for tuning into this video where we are going to talk about the end of the 1960s, 1968, which is the whole topic of your SLO paper. Why is 1968 the turning point of American history? In this video, we're going to get into that. This is going to be a three-part video. All right, so for this little segment, it's going to be three-part video, all on YouTube. That's going to be all posted at the same time, and I encourage you to look through this as we talk about this huge transitional moment in American history. Um, Now, in our last class, we discussed the 1960s, going into it, how it was a monumentous moment of change in the United States, how there was a great social, cultural change with hippies, and also we have the civil rights movement taking place at this time. And we got to talk about not only the African American civil rights movement with great figures like Martin Luther King and also Malcolm X, but also we talked about the Chicano movement, the Mexican American civil rights movement, along with the American Indian civil rights movement, all taking place in the same time throughout the 60s and 70s. Um, now, to many people, the 1960s was this great moment of change, right, where things started to change. But to many people, they thought that things changed a lot. Some people thought that things didn't change enough, that we should do even more to promote civil and equal rights in America. Also, there were many Americans looking back thinking, hey, maybe things changed too much. Let's go back to the good old days. And in part two of this video, we'll talk about the rise of like cop movies and westerns, which became very popular in the 60s and 70s. Sort of looking back to this imagined time in American history of law and order when everything's are great was great. So this is time when Americans were very divided, somewhat more divided than ever. And in the 1970s and 1968 in particular represents this turning point in American history. So our question of the day, right? Remember that this is a potential essay question for your final exam, which is why these lectures are so important to listen to. How did American society unravel in the mid 1960s throughout the 70s? So there, these ID terms will help you guide through that question, try to answer it, and talk about the problems that are existing in America at this time, and how things started to change, how things started to unravel. What we knew about America in the 50s and early 60s, coming out of World War II, that everything's great. America has this very secure place in the world. A lot of that stuff begins to go under question. The cracks in the whole system really started to shine through. They started to show people that, hey, maybe in America things aren't as well as the government's telling us. Maybe we shouldn't trust the government, and maybe there are some serious things that need to change in order to make America great. And these are the kind of questions that are being brought up in the 1970s. So chapter 28 in your textbook brought up this another music festival that took place 4 months after Woodstock. Remember, Woodstock being this huge music festival in the 60s, one of the largest musical festivals in American history. Um, so a few months after Woodstock, on December 6th, 1969, Allotment Motor Speedway in Northern California decided to throw a concert. And it sort of was like, how in movies, how sequels aren't really as great as the originals. That's sort of what Allotment is. That where the Woodstock Festival was more about peace and love and trying to celebrate the youth movements and stuff. And true, there was lots of drugs, alcohol, sex, and rock and roll taking place at Woodstock. This new music festival took that to a whole nother level, and sort of represented how in the turning into the 1970s, things started to unravel, things started to fall apart. Now, example of that is that for this music festival in 1969, the Rolling Stones were the headliners of this, so huge band at the time, great musical group. Um, Now, the people who put on alignment, they decided to pay the biker gang, the Hells Angels, $500 in beer in order to run security for the whole concert. Now, just a general rule, don't really. I want to encourage you to hire some bikers for security for a major event with hundreds of thousands of people. It probably wouldn't go well. So, as the Hells Angels progressively got more high and drunk during this concert, they armed themselves with pool sticks, as we could see in this picture, and they would beat up any concert goers who would try to climb up on stage and stuff. So the Grateful Dead, one of the other headliners for this concert, they decided not to play. They refused to play because as the day progressed, the crowd got more and more rowdy. Finally, the Rolling Stones came on stage. Now, Mick Jagger, he tried to calm everyone down, saying like, "Hey, calm down, so we could all enjoy this together, right?" But one concert goer, Meredith Hunter, was trying to climb on stage, and she was pushed back, and she pulled out a gun and started firing into the crowd. The Hells Angels immediately came up and stabbed him to death. All the while the Rolling Stones continued to play during the concert. So this shows how crazy this concert got. How people end up dying at this concert due to violence and how everything started to get crazy. And it also represented this growing change and tension that's taking place in the 19 turning into 1970s in American history. Which brings us back to the Vietnam War. In our last video, we discussed how America got involved in the Vietnam War, so I'm not really going to talk about that. But remember, we got involved in Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. The whole domino theory of if one country fell to communism, the rest would follow suit. So, uh, so going, which brings us to what's happening in the Vietnam War, right? In the very beginning of the war and the first years of it, the Vietnam War actually had a lot of public support, and mainly this was because uh, to the public, the government and the military decided to only show the people the good sides of the war, right? The good things that are happening. But as the war dragged on, and the U.S. seemed to move forward without a victory in sight, the Johnson administration increased the number of American ground troops from a few thousand in the early 1960s to nearly 200,000 in 1965. And then by 1968, the number of recruited Americans reached around 500,000. Uh, so the American public came to question the U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam. Why are we recruiting 500,000 people in 1968 for a war that is questionable? Why we should be there in the first place? So the main source of these troops, the main way that the U.S. got all these troops to enter military service was through the Selective Services Act, which we talked about with World War II, right? People were recruited, conscripted into war. So the Selective Services Act was reestablished during Vietnam and recruited many Americans. But the issue is that with the Selective Services Act in Vietnam in the 60s, it mainly recruited the poor and underprivileged people in America while largely protecting the wealthy and educated. So So, for example, both of my grandparents, they were sent draft cards and they were called into service during the Vietnam War. Um, Now, none of they both didn't end up going to Vietnam in particular, but they were drafted and put into military service for years during the Vietnam War. My one grandpa, he was sent to Arlington Cemetery, which is a one of the largest national cemeteries in America, and that's where they guard the tomb of the unknown soldier. Right, it's a very prestigious thing that only a select few in the U.S. military get to do. Also, I believe he helped out in funeral processions of people who died come and were buried in Arlington Cemetery during the Vietnam War. Um, but many people who were drafted, that my grandparents knew, were drafted to the Vietnam War, and some of them never returned, right? And that's the sad truth that during the Vietnam War, millions of half a million Americans were recruited to fight in a war that they didn't really understand what was going on in it. Our motives for being in the war was shaky, and there wasn't a clear end in sight, with the Viet Cong leading surprise attacks and guerrilla warfare. Right, you can't really fight an enemy that you can't win a decisive battle against, and that's sort of what's happening in Vietnam. Now, because of this, because of the outrage, because of the drafts, um, a lot of people started to resist. They started to have anti-war movements, protests, in order to oppose the Vietnam War. Now, uh, I was going to play the song Creedence Clearwater Revival's "Fortunate Son." It was a live video taking place in 1969. Um, and I provided a link for it here, but also on Blackboard too. So you could always just pause this video, click the link, and view this song. I was going to do it in this video, but then it got flagged for copyright, so I'm not going to do that. But pause the video, watch it, watch this music video, and then we'll talk about the lyrics a little bit. All right? Okay, so I'll trust that you watch the video, listen to the song. But really, if you've ever heard a Vietnam War, if you've ever seen a Vietnam War movie, you've seen this song before. It became one of the most popular anti-Vietnam War songs that took place during this time. So in the song, the songwriter uh, John Fogerty, he wrote about the hypocrisies taking place during this draft, during the Selective Services Act during Vietnam. He's talking about how that if he was a senator's son or a millionaire's son, or if he was born with a silver spoon, that he may have avoided the draft, that he may be protected and not sent off into to war and stuff. Um, and he wasn't born with a silver spoon, so unfortunately, that means that him, along with the poor and underprivileged Americans, they got sent off to war, while the rich people just paid their way out of it. They had connections to avoid the draft. Um, and this song became very popular at the time, and it showed the hypocrisies that were taking place during the Vietnam War, and caused many Americans to further not trust the government. When previously the majority of Americans trusted the government and stuff. So this resulted in many Americans burning their draft cards. Also, they avoided the draft. Some people actually fled to Canada in order to avoid the draft. While rich people, they ended up, not all rich people, many of them did get drafted and stuff, but a select uh, uh, vast majority of the people who were recruited were in fact lower class and underprivileged, and people at the time took note of that. So people start to not support the war. They started to have protests and all that stuff. But really, the turning point in the public opinion of Vietnam was really starting heightened in 1968 with the Tet Offensive. So the Tet Offensive, which took place in January of 1968, was a coalition, a group of Viet Cong North Vietnamese soldiers. They decided to attack more than 100 American and South Vietnamese sites throughout South Vietnam, including the American embassy in Saigon. While U.S. forces repulsed the attack and they did inflict tons of Viet Cong losses. Here it says 32,000 Vietnam and North Vietnamese soldiers lost their lives during the Tet Offensive, while the U.S. only lost 3,000. But the Tet Offensive, even though the U.S. repelled the attack, it showed the American people that body count, that it doesn't matter to the North Vietnamese how many people they lose in a fight, that they will continue to fight. They will not fight traditional wars. They will continue to lead guerrilla wars, and that perhaps Vietnam was unwinnable. That the U.S. military, through traditional military strategies, aren't able to fight back. Um, and if that's the case, why are we recruiting more and more Americans to fight and die in a country that can't be won? So after the Tet Offensive, reporters, mainly one of the most popular news anchors at the time, Walter Cronkite, he went over to Vietnam and he reported after the Tet Offensive what was going on. What did Vietnam really look like in the Vietnam War? Now, during the Vietnam War, there wasn't necessarily direct censorship of the war, right? But definitely the government and the U.S. military, um, they only showed reporters going to Vietnam a very small view of what the war really looked like, right? They didn't show them the dead. They didn't show them the places that were getting attacked, the villages that were getting burnt down. The reporters only saw a small image of this. That was until 1968, after the Tet Offensive, where news reports of this really took place. So Walter Cronkite, in the early 1960s, he was in support of the Vietnam War. He supported anti-communist activities, and he supported the U.S.'s efforts to try to stop the spread of communism. But after the Tet Offensive, he saw what the American military was really doing in Vietnam, and he went on the news and proclaimed that he saw firsthand how the war was going, and he said that the United States really should not be in Vietnam, which was huge because millions of Americans viewed Cronkite at this time as the guy who told the truth, right? So people listened to him. So after this, more and more reporters started to look into the war, see what was really happening in Vietnam, and this led to subsequent stories and images that eroded the public trust even further. In 1969, investigative reporter Seymour Hersh revealed that U.S. troops had raped or massacred hundreds of civilians in the village of My Lai in Vietnam. And so that was terrible, right? That was American troops doing these horrific war crimes. 3 years later, the Americans viewed a photograph by another reporter who photographed a naked Vietnamese child fleeing from a napalm attack. That one of the U.S.'s strategies was napalm, this burning sort of like liquid that can't be put out with water. And they would spray it across the forest. They would burn down entire villages. And the big thing is that many Americans, they could not tell the difference between a South Vietnamese person and North Vietnamese person. They couldn't tell the difference between civilian and military target, which caused, unfortunately, lots of innocents dying during Vietnam. So partly because of all this media coverage of the war, um, people started to lose interest in Vietnam. They started burning their draft cards. They started fleeing to Canada, not paying their income taxes, and leading marches on Washington, D.C. And after the Tet Offensive in 1968, on March 31st of that year, President Johnson announced on national television that he would not seek re-election in the next presidential campaign. So because of this, Johnson sort of like screwed the Democratic Party in this election. The Democratic Party didn't know what to do at this point. They tried to finding another promising candidate to run for president, but the American people had lost faith in the Democratic Party at this point, which led the Republican challenger Richard Nixon to be elected president by playing on fears and running on a platform of law and order, um, with also a vague plan to end the war. That if you elect Richard Nixon, he will put the war to an end. Now, this was a very vague plan, and he didn't specifically state how he would do this. But one of the big things Nixon promised was a honorable discharge, honorable end to the U.S. Involvement. He would later call this peace with honor. So what peace and honor look like, right? He basically said that, hey, we're not just going to leave South Vietnam. We're going to ensure that there's some sort of peace in place, and then we're going to leave. So Nixon became president, and he decided to go through with this strategy called the Madman strategy, which was basically the U.S. military bombing supply lanes across Laos and Cambodia, hoping to convince the North Vietnamese that they would do anything to stop this war. So another 3 years passed after Nixon was elected, and another 20,000 Americans died before agreement was reached. And after all this, Nixon finally convinced the North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh to go forth with a peace conference, which led to the Paris Peace Conference of 1973, which marked the official end of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. So the peace was like, okay, the U.S. is pulling out of this war, but North Vietnam, promise you're not going to invade South Vietnam. And North Vietnam's like, sure, yeah, if you leave, I won't attack South Vietnam. Well, the U.S. decided to leave Vietnam in 1975, and only a few months later, um, the North Vietnamese ended up invading South Vietnam, taking the whole country for itself, and then Vietnam became a communist country, despite all of America's fears of that happening. So now the Vietnam War caused Americans to lose trust in the government, which was a huge thing. That's part of the reason why it's such a turning point. This 1968 time, they believed that for decades what the U.S. government stance was on the Cold War and the Soviet Union and China was that if one country fell to communism, the rest would follow suit. And the only way to stop communism and the spread of it was to contain it, right? And by military force if necessary. But in the 70s, this whole plan unraveled. The Americans did not trust the government. Vietnam ended up being a failure, and Vietnam ended up being communist anyway. But you know what happened? The rest of the world didn't end. The rest of these countries across Southeast Asia, some of them sure may have turned to communism, but the world didn't come to an end. And also, we see after this point, after Vietnam, a transition in how America approached international diplomacy and the Cold War. That instead of offering direct military engagement in these countries like Vietnam and Korea, what they would do was work behind the scenes. They would sort of do things behind the scenes, support other groups to fight these battles for them, conduct proxy wars, and sure, in place a dictator to in charge of a government, as long as they were friendly to the United States cause. So the Vietnam War was a huge part of United States history, right? And we see this huge turning point of people, American citizens trusting the government to American citizens not trusting the government, and how it took decades for the United States populace to regain trust in the United States government after this. So, thank you for your attention. I encourage you to watch part 2 and 3 of these videos that are uploaded to YouTube. Remember that all these videos are very important because they deal with your final exam. All the things that we cover in these videos has the potential of showing up on your final exam. So please watch these videos. I make them for a reason, and I want you guys to learn. So I hope you're all safe and learning a lot, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.